Welcome to this very brief history of Leith 1920 to 2020. My name is Tim Bell and I came to live in Leith in 1980. A comprehensive history of a whole town over a century within living memory is an impossible task. What follows is a personal introduction which inevitably follows my own interests and perspectives, with some opinions, reduced to around 50 slides. My previous presentation of Leith history in the ReDrawing Edinburgh series finished in 1920, and we have to remind ourselves that unlike other areas included in the Edinburgh Extension Act, Leith had been a full-blown municipality for almost a century, with its distinctive medieval icon and motto, which is still such a strong identifier. The municipal amalgamation with Edinburgh was no more than an overdue bit of tidying up to keep pace with ever-expanding urbanisation, but it took no account of local feelings. In a local plebiscite, the vote was 6-1 against amalgamation. Municipal elections were held immediately. I strongly commend to you the website Leith Forever 100 Days. Day 1 introduces the situation at the time, and on day 66, the bitterness of Leith losing its identity like this is strongly caught in the account of a young Leither who had fought in the war. In the website, there are 100 well-researched, recently curated angles on Leith, and you're sure to find it interesting. In the terms of the Act was the provision that the Port of Leith would retain its name for maritime purposes. This map, dated 1928, shows the connections and the ambitions of the Port of Leith, and it remains the case that wherever in the world your ship is, Rotterdam, Taiwan, Buenos Aires, the chief officer plots a course for Leith. Recently, I was talking to a man from the Faroe Islands. When he was a lad in the 50s and 60s, Leith was the gateway to the British Isles. Edinburgh was somewhere in Scotland. The depression of the 1920s delayed the realization that the First World War had turned out to be the high point for Leith shipping. There was a brief and partial revival in the run-up to World War II, but it fell away immediately and never recovered. We'll come back to post-war shipping later in this presentation. And it wasn't only shipping. For many centuries, there had been a good shipbuilding industry, evolving with the technology of the day. For example, the Gothland had a working life for several shipping companies of 29 years, being broken up in Greece in 1961. That's a good size of ship. But in the town, there was no escaping the poverty that was almost worldwide during the 1920s and 30s. I said in my last presentation that the Leith Council put piped water into the tenements. Well, not all of them. There were 100% grants available to householders to remove 19th century lead piping as recently as 1980. One high point in the period was the opening of the children's ward of the hospital. This was Leith's War Memorial. There are no cenotaphs or other war statuary in Leith. For Leithers, the need to remember was particularly powerful, as Leith was home to most of the 228 dead at the Gretna train crash during the war. Hardly a family was left untouched. They hadn't left the country, but because they were in uniform and under orders, they were deemed to have fallen in action. The children's wing was opened with full military honours in 1929. The community at large undertook to maintain it, and look how seriously they went about it. There was an annual week of fundraising, and here are the master bakers, assembling for the pageant and fun and games and ceremony on Leith Links. look at the crowd of people behind them. On the van for the pageant supplied by A&R Todd was, "The bakers need the dough, so does Leith Hospital." You can see how the trades, the businesses and the community overlapped and how strong and precious this was. And the next war came. There are many genuine documents like this of potential targets, but Leith docks were never actually targeted. On the map is the Western Harbour, in Bow, under construction, as the breakwater wasn't yet finished. B is New Haven Fishing Harbour, but really they were after C, Henry Robb's shipyard, which is difficult to see. It's slightly to the right and below A on the map. An astonishing total of 43 ships were built in Leith during the war, a considerable contribution to the war effort. And a great number of pontoons for D-Day. They were towed down the east coast in the winter of 43-44, and they were made ready to follow the landings in June 44. There's a lot of Leith-made hardware in these photographs. There was some bomb damage in the town. This bomb was dropped by what they called a straggler, a German bomber going home from a raid elsewhere, randomly dropping bombs over a lit-up area. This site is well known now for a little bit of open space and the striking mural of Leith and New Haven life over a few decades. On the same evening, another bomb fell under the plane's flight path a few hundred yards away at Largo Place. The damage seems to be considerable. As you can see, only the corner building was demolished. After the war, Professor Gordon Donaldson lived in Leith and took an interest in the 1920 Edinburgh Extension Act. In a letter to the Scotsman, he noted that the 1920 Act laid certain obligations on Edinburgh. Firstly, there was a commitment in the Act to providing a new town hall. This was a strange commitment considering there already was a town hall on Constitution Street, and there was no municipal function for it to accommodate. What we have, opened in 1932, is a small cultural complex on Ferry Road, confusingly sometimes referred to as the Town Hall. I don't think the planted area in the pavement in front of the library shown on this proposal ever appeared. The large Leith Theatre is behind, to the right, and Thomas Morton Hall, named after a 19th century industrialist and benefactor, and an upper foyer are behind the janitor's house on the main street. There was also a commitment in the Act to providing bathing facilities between New Haven and Grantham, but instead we have a sewage pumping station. And there was a commitment in the Act to provide a large public park with facilities for football, which never appeared. Instead, the prohibition of football on Leith links was lifted. This was an issue because the natural state of the links is dunes, which were levelled and grassed over in the late 19th century. So Professor Donaldson wasn't wrong to worry that this thin layer of soil covering the dunes would quickly wear through, with, as he put it, serious consequences as a result. But I'm not aware that it's turned out to be a problem. Over half a century, dominated by depression and wartime, a good deal of the accommodation was in a poor state before the war, and it was no better afterwards. People were living in streets where demolitions were proceeding. North Junction Street is to the right here, with Admiralty Street running across the image in the middle distance. This puts the present Ocean Terminal a few hundred yards over the left shoulder of the photographer. Living in conditions like this is strongly associated with poverty. Millie Gray has written several books of fiction set in wartime and 1950s poverty, and Cooper Street, of this title, is just beyond Admiralty Street. She's profiled on day 77 of Leith 100 Days. And Leith could be rough, in public and behind closed doors. A doctor who was on night duty in Leith Hospital told a reminiscence group that one night, in the 1960s, the police brought in a man who had been beaten up. He had been knocking his wife about. The police took retribution into their own hands in the cells, and they'd overdone it a wee bit on this occasion. No questions, no reports. That was then. Leith could certainly be rough. Gumley and Davidson were the factors for many of the absentee landlords who were sharp enough collecting the rent and deaf to requests for improvements. A man who lived as a boy in this block beside Junction Bridge was well aware that it was substandard, but greatly appreciated the intimacy of the community. Quite naturally and inevitably, when the built environment is demolished and the people dispersed, the pre-war community spirit dissipates. If blocks like this had been sensitively refurbished, or if there had been any attempt to engage constructively and meaningfully with the people, the best of it might not have been lost. Leith Town Centre lost approximately 20,000 families in 2 decades after the war. There's almost unanimous agreement that while the demolitions in the streets were bad enough, what really tore the heart out of Leith was the demolition of the Kirkgate. The businesses marked in this map are dated to 1926, and clearly some premises had changed hands by the 1960s. BBC Panorama did an investigation into poverty in Scotland, finding most where they expected it, in and around Glasgow, but it exposed a small pocket of acute poverty in Leith. In one clip that I've seen, in what looks like Junction Street, a woman is stoically telling the interviewer that her husband has pneumonia and their flat is damp. Edinburgh, preening itself as a provincial capital and international festival city, was shocked, and, perhaps oversimplifying it, but perhaps not by much, they took the view that a few more demolitions would fix the statistics. For the next photograph, find the Gaiety Theatre on the right-hand page, towards the top on the left. That's the Gaiety for sale, with the Leith lampposts proudly outside. Theatre groups used to come to Leith Central Station at the top of the street, carrying their props, and set up at the Gaiety for a week's entertainment. All much appreciated. The picture on the right is looking the other way, so the Gaiety is just round the corner to the left, out of sight. The image on the right is taken from about the position of the 2 women in the roadway in the older photograph. To quote from the Council's document, Leith Conservation Area Character Appraisal of about 20 years ago, quote, "The Kirkgate was Old Leith's main street, with a lively and varied streetscape. The intimate urban pattern of winding streets and densely grouped buildings was lost in the redevelopment of the 1960s. The Kirkgate housing development is a courtyard of low-rise housing with zigzag-rendered fronts, which is terminated by the multi-story slab of Linksview House." End quote. Moving the camera back 100 yards or so from the earlier image, we have the 1960s shopping precinct run by a management company. Family businesses need to own their own premises. The last family business left the precinct long ago. This was also happening elsewhere, of course, but this is an early case, and the suddenness and totality of it was a very great shock, and it had a profound impact not only on the social side of Leith life, but also on the microeconomic profile, as relatively wealthy people could no longer earn their living here. The community centre at the far end was little more than a few sports halls to replace the ones lost in the surrounding demolitions. The whole precinct has been refurbished more recently, and the community centre now has an extra floor and several pleasant and useful meeting rooms and halls. And there's a nice cafe overlooking a rare patch of green in the kirkyard opposite. There's little doubt that if the kirkgate had been sensitively refurbished instead of demolished, it would now be an urban bijou and a tourist trap. But total demolitions and new builds were the fashion in the 1960s, and concrete was a new material that permitted new shapes. Labour councillor Pat Rogan was an enthusiast. He wasn't a Leith councillor, but he had strong Leith connections. The Conservative Council made him chair of the Housing Committee in 1962. Cable's Wynd, named after a popular Dutch trader of that name, was in a poor condition, and now we have what are almost universally known as the banana flats. One man who was at the topping out ceremony here, and I think Pat Rogan would be there too, insists there was an optimism in the air. This was the brave new world. You can say what you like about the appearance and style of the banana flats, but they're now listed as a protected building, a fine example of its brutalist kind. It isn't leaky or porous, it isn't infested with anything ineradicable, and it's secure accommodation. The fact remains, however, that according to the Scottish Government in 2020, this is the 11th most multiply deprived postcode in Scotland. It has fared better than either Fort House and Cairngorman Grampian houses, all built in the same period and didn't last half a century. With such short lives, there has to be a question. Were they ever fit for purpose from the beginning? And were they any sort of return on investment? Many Leithers were evacuated to the Muirhouse scheme, 3 miles to the west, and it too has been almost entirely demolished. The upper two photographs were taken in directly opposing directions. The lower photograph shows, the two lower photographs show what's there now. In the fort, there's the same number of family units on the site now as there were in the old block, each with an outside front door and a bit of garden. This map of the railways is dated 1928, but nothing of significance in Leith had changed except that the whole network had been nationalised after the war. They all closed during the 1960s. The photo on the bottom left is the last departure from Leith Cally, as it was called, on the 28th of April 1962. The council acquired most of the alignments, and many of them now make nice walkways and cycle routes. The only line to survive this period was the one running east through Portobello, latterly used only for carrying imported coal to Kirkensey Power Station until it was decommissioned in 2013. It hasn't been used since then. Just under the name Leith on the map, at the end of the blue spur, find the station marked Central Pass, passenger. Leith Central Station was different. With its magnificent roof, it was a dedicated passenger station, almost completely useless for the whole of its miserably short working life from 1903, and the last passenger train pulled out in 1952. 49 years. There is no known explanation for the sheer size of the thing. It lay derelict and empty until it became useful in the 1960s, as British Rail had to convert from steam to diesel, and for a few years the Haymarket sheds were not enough. It was known to British Rail as Depot 64H. The rounded archway in the middle left was at the top of the ramp leading up from Leith Walk, seen in the inset. The ramp now greatly narrowed and leading only to the threshold of the green door. In 1969, the western breakwater leading north from New Haven was complete. You can see in the top left photograph that a coffer dam was built to meet a new lock. On a suitable high tide in June 1969, the Duke of Edinburgh closed the lock, creating the largest enclosed deep-water port in Scotland. In the docks and right up to the shore and beyond, the water level is permanently held at approximately 1 foot higher than mean high tide. In the middle picture, you can see the ladder going down to a level that was useful to the ships tying up there at all levels of the tide. The last seagoing ship left that berth in the late 1950s, whereupon the bridge was made solid and the swinging mechanism was removed. Rubbish and debris is now accumulating to the point where a family of swans can find a safe place to nest under the bridge at the far end. The photograph in the next slide is taken from a few yards upstream to the right. The ring behind the people sitting down reminds us that seagoing ships used to tie up here. But with naturally occurring solids from upstream being deposited and not sluiced out by the tides, the riverbed is now rising to the point where there are several unsightly islands on which larger and larger pieces of debris get stuck. They become more obvious year by year. The tidal reach goes almost a mile upstream, and if this continues without intervention, the whole width and length will eventually become a slow-moving swamp. We have to presume that it won't come to that. A constant water level is far more convenient for loading and unloading cargo. I can't get a better resolution of the pictures along the bottom from the 1960s. On the left is a chap hoisting a bundle of deck chairs labelled Leith. In the middle photograph are 2 men sorting out sacks of grass seed. And on the right are 4 men knee-deep in a cargo of fertilizer. By today's standards, they're all downright dangerous, and by any standards, the 2 on the right are positively unhealthy. But industrial PPE was getting much better, and mechanization of the process was introduced, putting a lot of men out of work. Leith experimented with containers, which need a fixed gantry. A chain and a grab bucket's no good for them. You can see some containers beside the McVan gantry, but meaningful volumes of containers need a lot of space for stacking and suitable road and railways in the hinterland. If Forth Ports had continued with containers, Leith would have lost its traditional street pattern of pavements and right-angle junctions, to be replaced by dual carriageways and flyovers with rounded corners. The Leith container berth was discontinued, and practically all containers in and out of Scotland passed through Grangemouth. The fixed gantry was later used for pipes. On this recent government map, Leith is nowhere to be seen. For a trivial hour more at sea to Grangemouth, Cargo vessels are much closer to central Scotland and right on the motorways and railways. Where's the nearest motorway or railway line to the port of Leith? I don't have more recent official figures in the same format that we saw earlier, but the 1959 figures work out at 7 cargo vessels coming into Leith every day of the year, and many of them would be staying in port for 2 or 3 or 4 days, making a dozen or 15 in port, working on any day. When I was working in the docks 20 years ago, 3 or 4 cargo ships working was a busy day. Now, the number is more like 1 a day. It may well be that in 100 years' time, Leith, as an international trading port, will have gone the way of Corus and Bowness before. There is a nascent offshore renewable energy industry that will need to be serviced, and Leith could be well placed for that. You'll see other ships in Leith all the time. Freight isn't the only reason for going to sea. What with widespread demolitions and unemployment, when I came to Leith in 1980, it seemed like a great big gap site. Both of the top 2 photographs are dated 1980. I didn't take them, but I did take the lower ones recently. Jack Kellett, a man of Edinburgh, used a radio broadcast to offer an image of Edinburgh with castle-like security, surrounded by establishment functions such as banking, university, the courts, the festival and all, leaving Leith exposed to all the elements, vagaries and economic storms. Leith still had some of the worst slums in Western Europe and was overlooked by Edinburgh in more ways than one, except, he said, as a site for academic studies into multi-deprivation. He said later, Leithers were in the grip of depression, and the prevailing mood was worsening as poverty increased with Mrs. Thatcher's economic policies in the 1980s. Addy was joined by a notable scribe of the period, Robert Garrioch, in the green jacket in Alexander Moffat's well-known composite portrait. He wrote, Leith, once a genuine community, nourished from within by the life of its own townsfolk, has been destroyed. Not just as a built-up area, but as an organism with people left here and there among the ruins, who still regard themselves as Leithers, whose present situation is intolerable and officially temporary, and who are not likely to find elsewhere the same sense of fulfillment, an unperceived sense of well-being like good health, that used to be the great thing about Leith. And he finished a poem, well, Leith's maistly rubble now. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the amalgamation in 1920, however necessary and inevitable it was, and whether or not blame can be laid at the door of the municipality, the blunt truth is that Leith was not sharing in Edinburgh's prosperity. The 1980s saw some serious losses. Training ship Dolphin had already been towed away. Many Leith boys got a taste for the sea and some early training for a life on the waves. The more academic boys studied at the Nautical College, which in the 1980s was reduced to apartment at Julianesque College and later disappeared altogether. The last ship went down the slip at Henry Robb's shipyard, where Ocean Terminal stands now, in 1983, and the yard closed in 84, leaving the 700 workforce, mostly men, without work. Although Tom Farmer at QuickFit recruited a handful of experienced engineers from this and other closures in the docks, for most there was no transition period, no training for new skills, and there was nothing to go to. All this with the government talking of benefit scroungers. I'm not making party political points here. I'm describing the pain. Leith was not given development area status. Development areas offered generous relocation and startup grants. In the 1950s, around 80% of Scotch malt whisky was matured and bonded in Leith, much of it in the warehouses in Commercial Street, which have converted so nicely into flats above and shops and offices below. This industry transferred mostly to Broxburn, with its development area status. Similarly, Edinburgh Crystal, a Leith firm, took the lure and went to Pennycook. Crawford's Bakery closed. These big employers took many smaller businesses with them. Leith Hospital closed. I remember Ron Brown MP saying, "They can't do that. It's our hospital." I'm afraid he was wrong on both counts. The closure was for good reasons of delivering medical care with newer technology. But the hospital was much loved and the closure hurt. The much appreciated annual Remembrance Day service held in the War Memorial Children's Wing has transferred to the new treatment centre in Junction Place. Leith Theatre closed. Look at the size of it. This must have been one of the last performances before it was mothballed for 30 years, and it's still shaking off the effects of the years of minimal maintenance. As Edinburgh tidied up for the Commonwealth Games in 1984, pretty much as a policy decision, Leith became a dustbin. Heroin arrived, unerringly finding areas of high unemployment. On my tours around Leith, I usually give the heroin adage: if you have a life, you don't do heroin. But if there are gaps in your life, heroin will find the gaps. There were many, many gaps in personal and community life in Leith in the 1980s. Leith became a centre of street prostitution. The police realised that a lot of the women were heroin addicts. Some of them were decoys for their pimps who were also heroin dealers. It was a dirty and dangerous and confused situation. And HLTV3 arrived, strongly associated with gay men. It was in Leith and Muirhouse that it was discovered that intravenous drug abusers were bigger carriers than gay men, dramatically and emphatically changing the demographic of the disease. It was rapidly renamed HIV. Almost unremarked at the time was the demolition of Leith Central Station. It had got into a terrible state. It was a very considerable covered space at almost 3 acres. And the height and depth were remarkable too. The track beds were well above the first floor level. They were on top of the 3rd level of rough stone in the middle picture. With this enormous potential, several possibilities were seriously floated. It was a good shape for a transport museum. It was big enough for a small sports stadium with or without the roof. It could be made into a concert hall and an arts complex. You could put a Guggenheim in there. By the time a young man wrote a short story set here, it was decided. We would have a supermarket, a water world, and a car park. In the story, the fictional character coming home for Christmas from London walks past the playhouse at the top of Leith Walk and sees Edinburgh folk enjoying an evening's entertainment and a meal at the nearby restaurants. With a friend, he walks up the ramp off the pavement at Leith Walk through the arch in the middle of the image on the right. And there's a reflection in the story that this is the end of the year, the end of the line, the end of Leith Central Station, and all its potential coming to nothing. The short story ends with the fictional character heading in the wrong direction for home, his homecoming to Leith brought to nothing. A friend of the author created this image as a visual depiction of the themes, intentionally It has Edinburgh yuppies partying on a train while Leith skeletons look away, a ghost train in reverse. This mood was picked up in the Proclaimers' song Letter from America. Bathgate no more, Linwood no more, Methil no more, Irvine no more. We get the impression that if Leith had two syllables, Leith would be in the song. This short story became an episode in a longer story, Trainspotting. The publishers were placing it as fiction set among urban distress, highlighting the review of Jeff Torrington, author of Swing Hammer Swing, fiction set in the demolitions of the Gorbals, Glasgow. Torrington wrote that Trainspotting mounts a ferocious attack on the body state, and there's only passing reference to junkies. Almost immediately, however, it became much better known for its foul language and as a depiction of the heroin scene. The stage play and the film both take the story away from Leith, but Trainspotting and the Proclaimers' song Sunshine on Leith, and later the feel-good musical of the same name, are indelibly part of Leith's cultural heritage. Just as, in many people's eyes, Leith was being unfairly tarnished by association with Trainspotting, in the 1990s, Leith's fortunes were very rapidly turning. Forth Ports Authority was privatised and is now Forth Ports plc. The start of the tall ships race from Leith in 1995 was a howling success, bringing in many thousands of people from Scotland and beyond. The old sailors' home became Malmaison Hotel. Many of us were astonished that Holiday Inn Express made a new build on an old access road into the docks, and they've since built an extension. The new Scottish office was built, bringing in almost 1,500 well-paid, secure jobs and providing a base for small businesses nearby. The late Donald Dewar worked a minor miracle in persuading the former Royal Yacht Britannia to berth permanently in Leith. She was built on the Clyde, and there was a strong case for her going home. But this was around the time of the devolution referendum. There was even talk of putting a new parliament in Leith, although it eventually went to Holyrood. Over the years since, Britannia has become one of Scotland's biggest single tourist draws. On the site of Henry Robb's shipyard, a brand new destination shopping mall with small auditorium cinema screens sprang up, and Britannia moved alongside. People who had lived in Edinburgh all their lives came to Leith for the first time. Ocean Terminal is now the terminus for several Lothian buses routes, including an airport bus. A new access road was built in West Granton, connecting Leith with the Forth Road Bridge, the airport and the M8. 20 years ago, a stranger reading the mapping and the branding of Leith might think that Leith was a suburb of Ocean Terminal. More recently, not only in response to the present threat of the pandemic to the retail sector, but also to a lot of new housing going up directly opposite, it is making some effort to get on better with the natives. Over the last half-century, there have been many new arrivals in Leith. Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims all have established worship centres in former Church of Scotland churches in Leith. And we're well into the second and third generations now. Born Leithers. I recently took these 8 photographs of new businesses in no more than 20 minutes, on or within a few yards of Junction Street, and there are more. In modern Leith, there are many histories, languages, and interests thrown together. One homegrown new feature is the statue of Dr. John Rattray, signatory to the earliest rules of golf for playing on the links of Leith in 1744. Leith Rules Golf Society, initiator of the project, has had several enquiries from bus tour companies planning to make a stop here. It's already an established fact that if you rub the ball, the next time you play a round, you'll have a hole in one. Anyone who's disappointed obviously didn't rub the ball correctly. New residential developments are springing up on almost every scrap of brown land. Leith seems certain to continue to be one of the most densely populated areas of Scotland. They say that being a Leither is a state of mind. The most convenient geographical edge to Leith is the postcode EH6, which is roughly the pre-amalgamation boundary. And what's holding us together? The annual Leith Festival, a direct child of the week of fundraising for the hospital, is a very popular and open celebration of diversity with hundreds of events. Rescheduled this year to September, COVID restrictions permitting. Leith can't buck the political, economic and social tides, but there is a new generation that is forming a microclimate of community and artistic expressions that I believe is distinctive to Leith. You'll appreciate that there are many strands and characters and issues and places, and with that, all much colour is missing from this brief introduction. And I didn't even mention the trams. Come and see us. You'll be welcome.